Hi, my name is Jorge Ruiz, and I am discussing an ethical analysis of the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. First, war has been a grave matter plaguing man since known human history. Starting with St. Augustine, war has been seen as a matter which can be justified under certain legitimate means by what has developed into just war doctrine. And just war doctrine has 7 main conditions. The first being that legitimate constitutional authority should be making the war decisions. 2, that the war should be waged for a just cause. 3, statesmen should resort to war with the right intentions. 5, the evils of war, especially the loss of human life, should be proportionate to the injustice to be prevented or remedied by war. 5, peaceful means to prevent or remedy injustice should be exhausted or last resort. 6, an otherwise just war should have reasonable hope of success. 7, that war must be conducted by just means. With regards to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the issue of terrorism also comes into play. Terrorism has become globally recognized as an issue since the terrorist attacks on 9/11 in New York and Washington, D.C. With the 9/11 attacks, the United States has become involved in the war on terrorism, especially in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so the question is, were these wars justifiable under just war doctrine? The first document that I looked at was by Tom Ferrer, titled Unjust War Against Terrorism and the Struggle to Appropriate Human Rights. His thesis is that, taking the sum of the criteria of just war doctrine, the war on terrorism in Iraq by the Bush administration cannot be considered justified. He starts off looking at the different criteria, first with the legitimate authority, and comparing Afghanistan and Iraq. He considers Afghanistan, that war, to have legitimate authority, as not just by the fact that the U.S. is a sovereign nation, but also the fact that the UN Security Council also gave them authority to undertake that armed conflict. With regards to Iraq, Ferrer considers it the U.S. not to have that authority, as the UN Security Council did not give them those rights to that armed conflict. With regards to just cause, the U.S. war in Afghanistan provided just cause by Ferrer in the fact that the Taliban of Afghanistan were harboring al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, who was responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The justification for the war in Iraq, it was more problematic, as it seemed to be an attempt to preempt the transfer of possible weapons of mass destruction, and it was also claimed to promote the human rights of the Iraqi citizens by removing of Saddam Hussein, who was a dictator. And some of the problems that Ferrer sees with this is that the UN inspections later on found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. As well, there seems to be no connections between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, which was one of the supporting arguments for the claim of promotion of human rights. Also, Saddam Hussein, although he was a dictator and committed various atrocities in the past, in 2003 there were no humanitarian crises within Iraq to justify war. Lastly, with regards to right intention and last resort, in Iraq, since right intention is linked with just cause, and in Iraq there was a lack of just cause, this prevents the presumed good intention of removing a dictator from being a right intention. Also, there were many more things that the United States could have done instead of the last resort of going to war. And they could have continued to push for inspections and legislation on Iraq in terms of weapons of mass destruction, if they existed. The second article by Walter Daum, David Mandel, and Ryan Criss, titled "How Just Were America's Wars? A Survey of Experts Using a Just War Index." This was a survey of more than 100 international studies experts rating the justness of the 18 major conflicts fought in the U.S. since 1900. The methods that they took, they surveyed individuals who were doctorate holders, primarily as university professors, and these surveyees were chosen from a membership list of the International Studies Association. 1,000 surveys were sent out. Only 132 of the surveys were returned. 23 were excluded due to lack of completion. So total, the sample size of the surveys was 109. And they used a 7-point index to score the 7 criteria of just war doctrine. And these 7 points were number 1, just cause; number 2, right intention; number 3, net belief; number 4, a legitimate authority; number 5, last resort; number 6, proportionality of means; and number 7, right conduct. And each criteria was rated on a scale of -3, which meant strongly disagree, to +3, which meant strongly agree. And and 0 meant neutral. There was also an option to indicate if the surveyee was unfamiliar with the conflict. The results. The surveyors provided values for overall justification, which they titled the J value, and also they took the average of the 7 criteria of just war, titled the Just War Index, or JWI. As a disclaimer, the authors made no claim about which J or JWI scores would be appropriate to license any kind of armed conflict. In terms of the results, World War II, just to kind of get a bearing, World War II had the highest J and JWI scores, with a J score of 1.95 and a JWI score, just war index score, of 1.42, of a possibility of 3. The war in Afghanistan, the U.S. war in Afghanistan, had a J score of 1.43 and a JWI score of 1.03. The war in Iraq, the 2003 war in Iraq, had the lowest J score and JWI score of all 18 conflicts. The J score, the overall justification score, was -1.70, and the just war index score was a -1.75. The third paper by Carey Stewart, titled "Just War and Terrorism: A New Policy Perspective," in which his thesis is, with terrorism and preemptive strikes becoming commonplace within the realm of war, it is time to reevaluate the possibility of terrorism or preemptive strikes becoming morally acceptable tools of war. He starts off looking at a cultural framework. First, that just war doctrine has developed mostly within a Christian framework in the West, and that the Islamic framework for war does not distinguish between just and holy wars. Also, he notes that preemptive strikes have been widespread throughout the Middle East since the 1950s, giving various examples, including in 1956 with France, Great Britain, and Israel attacking Egypt. 1967, Israel again attacks Egypt. 1981, Israel destroys a nuclear research facility in Iraq as a preemptive strike. And he also mentions the 2003 U.S. attacks on Iraq in the contention that Saddam Hussein violated various U.S. resolutions. And Stewart states that these various preemptive strikes have caused an increase in the use of suicide bombers and other acts of terrorism in retaliation to the preemptive strikes being brought about by the various nations in the Middle East. And from this, Stewart notes that there are various questions that arise from the use of terrorism and preemptive strikes. The first question is that are these preemptive strikes justified on a presumption of future possible harm by countries that might be affected through the use of terrorism? And also, are the rules of war subject to change depending on who is involved? In this case, is when the war is against a terrorist organization, or whether the war is for religious reasons, or whether the war is for economic or other various reasons. And then finally, the question of can terrorism or preemptive strikes be used as a legitimate policy tool? And Stewart does note that both terrorism and preemptive strikes have been considered by many within academia to be illegitimate actions. One thing that Stewart mentions is that within his paper, proposing these various questions, he considers the correctness of an action not to be the object of his paper, and that whether an action is justified depends solely on the interpretation of accepted policy of those groups who engage in the conflict. With regards to my own thoughts, considering just war doctrine, the war in Afghanistan may be considered a just war, whereas the war in Iraq cannot be considered a just war. I would first like to disagree with Stewart in the third paper in terms of looking at correctness and justification. I do not believe that correctness and justification can be separated in a moral issue. What is incorrect cannot be justified. And that although preemptive strikes and terrorism are more commonplace and groups behind them have various reasons for taking on those actions, they cannot be considered right conduct in armed conflicts. And with regards to the first and second papers, I'm pretty much in agreement with them, especially in terms of the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan had a just cause. The U.S. was fighting against Al-Qaeda, who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks, and they had the intention of striking again. With regards to the war in Iraq, I do not consider that to be a war that had a just cause, just as the first two papers did, although I do disagree with the first paper, Farrer, in terms of legitimate authority. I do believe that the United States, as a sovereign country, sovereign state, has the authority to start a war, but I also agree with Farrer that the threat of weapons of mass destruction and the removal of Saddam Hussein were not just causes for going to war with Iraq. And even if those were just causes, that would have been a last resort. There were many other recourses that could have been taken. The war in Iraq seems to be more of a preemptive strike that could not be just justified as a just act. Thank you.